I have the honor of, hopefully, introducing our next speakers today. I'd like to introduce two dedicated, amazing speakers who both run nonprofit organizations. Dave Ford from the Ocean Plastic Leadership Network, and Ian Rosenberger, who's the founder and CEO of First Mile and Day Owl. I am so looking forward to their talk, and so I'd like to turn it over to them to kick off the next hour. Thank you very much, Dave and Ian.
Can you guys hear us okay? Yeah? Are we out there? Oh, good.
Hello, hello. Check, check.
Excellent. We're the two tallest guys in Vegas this morning. There you are, you're alive. 9 o'clock in Vegas on a Wednesday morning is a tough time to give a talk, let me tell you. Thank you so much, Susan. Wonderful as always. It's so good to see you, and you've been such a good advocate in this space for such a long time. We really appreciate you being here. Before we get started, we were thinking it would be really good to get a sense of who the hell all of you are. I would like to know, just toss out where you're from, like what industry. We'd just like to hear. I know we're all here for a WasteExpo, but I've talked to a couple people around breakfast. So, sir, where are you from? What's your deal? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Just yell it out there. Dan.
St. Louis, Missouri. Conversion energy systems, creating energy from plastic.
Yeah, great. Okay, good. Conversion energy. Excellent. Pyrolysis, chemical recycling, stuff like that. All right, who else? Somebody else toss out there.
You just yell it out. Don't be shy. We're waking up together.
I'm going to pick on
everybody.
you. Go ahead.
I'm Brandon Kirkson from RealPage. We're a large software company that specializes in multifamily and the solutions. So we have a waste solution for...
Cool. Waste software. Excellent. I talked to somebody before who was a packaging consultant. Where was that person? Yeah, go ahead. Great. Excellent. Anybody else? Over here. How about somebody over here? Yeah, go ahead. Excellent. Good. Environmental sustainability consultant. So we have some consultants. We have some folks in the waste industry, and the software industry, and the waste to conversion energy industry. Excellent.
Maybe can we, just for those of you, we're not going to be able to go around to everybody. How many of you are working directly in the waste removal general sort of, can you raise your hand?
Cool.
How about like material design, secondary materials?
Yeah, good.
Recycling, people working, a lot of recycling.
I feel like those are inextricable these days, aren't they? Good. Excellent. Well, we'll introduce ourselves, and then we'll get rocking and rolling. I'll start. My name's Ian Rosenberger. As Susan said, I'm the CEO and founder of both First Mile and Day Owl, two organizations that have very similar aims. Day Owl actually helps to map and assess supply chains all over the world. We help big brands develop human rights frameworks for their supply chains. We create living income strategy for human-powered supply chains in the global south, so we work primarily outside of the US. But the simple fact of the matter is that waste and recycling and sustainability, as Susan mentioned, is changing rapidly in these spaces. So we help brands navigate those. Susan tossed up on the screen a number of companies that have 2025 and 2030 sustainability goals. And a lot of brands will set these because there's a lot of public pressure, a lot of investor pressure, a lot of stakeholder pressure to toss a goal out there. And then many of them will really have no idea how they're going to get there. And some of these are some of the larger Fortune 100, Fortune 500 brands on the planet. So we help brands navigate that strategy. How do you actually get to what this means, both from a climate perspective, but also more specifically from a waste perspective and a materials perspective. But then more than that, we help them implement those solutions. So over 10 or 15 years working in low-income communities, people who actually pick up waste for a living, we've developed programming that helps people pick up waste more efficiently, more profitably, and with an attitude and an orientation towards human rights and human dignity. We actually ask 3 questions for the most part when we sit down with a new client. How much material do you put out into the world, right? Just straight and simple. If you're a Unilever, or Coca-Cola, or PepsiCo, or Nestle, how much material are you actually making, right? The second question we ask is, how much material do you bring back and use again? Now, a lot of brands have good answers for this. A lot of brands have good plans for how much material they're actually bringing back and putting into their supply chain. So this is like recycled content goals, things like post-consumer recycled plastic, right, for example. We put X amount of thousands, hundreds of thousands of tons out into the world each year. We make sure that we collect Y amounts. Usually it's X minus Y, right? Here's the really important question. How much material do you bring back under any human or any framework of actual human rights? And here is where we generally are met with a deafening sound of crickets. Because brands are, now past 10 years have gotten used to setting up these goals, but are really, really bad at understanding how that material is actually being collected. And the sad fact of the matter is that when you open up that Pandora's box, you're met with a pretty sad state of affairs specifically in the global south. A lot of child labor, a lot of forced labor, indentured service. It's a cash business, right? So there's a lot of predatory lending, things that can get folks into trouble. And brands into trouble, which is why they generally stay away from engaging in these supply chains in those areas. So what we say is we like to turn liabilities into leadership. We help brands engage in these spaces in order to do that really, really effectively. And we've gotten really good at that.
Hey, Ian, real quick.
Yeah.
Global South, can you define, it's a World Bank term that's very politically correct, but maybe it'd be good to dive in that.
Yeah, sure. So we define the Global South as we've used different words for these over the past 15, 20 years. Sometimes you've heard the phrase, maybe the bottom billion. You might have heard like low income countries. The old term would be third world countries. We don't use that term anymore. But the Global South is generally the areas of the world, even though it's not always just south of the equator, this is where the vast majority of the world's population exists, and something I'll talk about in a little bit. Therefore, the vast majority of the world's consumers, the vast majority of the world's producers, and the vast majority of the world's influence on actually how you do business in waste every single day, which I'll talk about in a bit. Does that answer your question?
It does.
All right, great. I'm going to hand it over to Dave so he can talk a little bit about himself and where he's headed.
Thank you, sir. Hi, everyone. So good to be here. My name is Dave Ford, founder of the Ocean Plastic Leadership Network. So just want to tell you a little story of how we came to be. So I actually was running for years an expedition company, and we were taking senior leaders, senior management, and immersing them directly in some of the world's most challenging environmental problems. So we were taking C-suite groups to Antarctica and Greenland, did a lot of human-wildlife conflict, where we would take groups to Zimbabwe, like where Cecil the lion was killed, if you remember. We've done a lot of work in southern India. And we were on an expedition in southern India where we were introducing these senior leaders to the complexity of elephants and tigers at war with humans in a very, I would say, volatile region where there are a lot of people, a lot of animals, and if the tigers would disappear, the entire ecosystem would break down. And on the way back, I went to Delhi, and I had the opportunity to spend the day with a team of university professors that took me on a waste tour. And they took me to the Gazipur landfill, which I'm showing here. And when I was there, half of it was smoking on fire, and the other half, there were hundreds of people wading through this mountain that is really in the middle of the city. I mean, there's not just one. There's these, all over India and all over Delhi, there's these giant mountainous landfills, and it just blew my mind. There were thousands of hawks circling around that were feeding off of the waste that was in there. It smelled, and then there were just cows everywhere walking around outside. It really was just such a profound, tangible impact. And meanwhile, we've been taking groups to Antarctica pointing at rocks that used to be covered with ice, and showing pictures, and no one's ever going to complain about Antarctica. It's one of the most amazing places in the world. But the plastic crisis was so tangible and so poignant that we went out and we chartered a ship that was headed from Antarctica to the Arctic, and we ran the first ever Ocean Plastic Leadership Summit. So that's where Ian and I met. That's where Susan Robinson and I met. We had 165 leaders with us, 500 miles off the coast of Bermuda, activists to industry, stuck on a boat for 4 days together. We had Break Free from Plastic leaders, Greenpeace, with the American Chemistry Council, and there was nowhere to go. So on this expedition, we were snorkeling around pulling handfuls of plastic waste out of it's called one of the 5 gyres, the Atlantic Gyre. We had a consumer packaged good company that makes toothbrushes find one of their toothbrushes 500 miles into the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. It was really powerful, and it launched the Ocean Plastic Leadership Network. So the Ocean Plastic Leadership Network today is 108 organizations. We call it a network as opposed to a community because we really have oppositional forces. We have Coca-Cola, Pepsi, P&G, Unilever, Kimberly-Clark. We have the World Economic Forum, the World Wildlife Fund, Waste Management. Tamra is here, they're new members. Really across this ecosystem. And if there's a unifying principle, it's that all of these organizations want to solve this problem. They just have vastly different ways of going about it. So this is not really me, but metaphorically, this is me.
Wouldn't it be cool if it was him, though?
It's definitely not
just
really
your
me.
face on there.
On a tightrope between activist interests and industry interests. And while the day where I'm on the phone with the American Chemistry Council, and the next call will be with Greenpeace. And it's pretty interesting, and it's pretty tricky. And I talk about this. I get hit with sticks from all sides, which enables us to stay on this tightrope. But it's really important. So, we talked about the power of experience and tangibility. That could be as simple as touring a MRF and having a deep understanding of how a recycling facility works, or it could be in the middle of the gyre, or immersing in the global south with Ian's operations. But also this positional understanding, like this idea that if we learn from what the opposing forces are all about, it's going to make us understand this problem on a much deeper level. And I think what we've proved is that a lot of times the delta that we think is out there between activists and industry is really shrinking. And a lot of times activist groups are fighting battles from 10 years ago. And we are seeing an incredible amount of movement from industry. It's certainly not anywhere where the activist groups would like it to be, but it's definitely tangible and completely different ballgame from 3 years ago and even last year. So our North Star as an organization, we'll call it rapid capacity building. So we talked about the experiential piece and the positional piece. And there's also just baseline rooting into the facts. So we have software called Sustainable Action Leadership Training, where we're going out and educating on the 101s entire companies, where the CFO and somebody running a factory, or even somebody on the factory floor, can have the same narrative and the same baseline understanding about ESG, about climate change, about recyclability, about circularity, about deforestation. And it's just so important to have that baseline understanding inside of an organization. And Susan talked a lot about just general, the risk management challenges that are really coming head on with respect to environmental, the environmental challenges of this world are becoming businesses, risk management, and education is so important. So let's talk a little bit about facts. Well, right now, the best facts that we have is 11 million metric tons of plastic entering the ocean every year. So 11 million metric tons is the equivalent of about a garbage truck and a half of plastic every minute getting into the oceans.
And that's up, right, Dave? That's up from 8 million.
That's up from 8 million, and it's also wrong. And the reason it's wrong is because it's all off of 2016, 2017 data. So the first thing to understand about facts is that they're always changing, and that it's important to have this continual education. We don't yet know the impact that COVID has had on the plastic crisis. 99% of these masks are made of plastic, and you've seen them all over the environment, and 129 billion this is projections that came out in the beginning of the pandemic that have held up. 129 billion masks used per month. That's enough masks to cover the entire country of Switzerland in a year, and that includes mountains and everything else. The other thing with respect to the plastics crisis is it's like a fire hose of information. There is absolutely no way that any human being or even organization can stay on top of it. It's nonstop, it keeps coming, and whether it's if you guys haven't seen the John Oliver piece on plastics, it's pretty incredible. But incredible amount of environmental groups are putting out reports every day, and then you have industry putting out incredible reports and initiatives, and it's just like drinking from the fire hose, and it's impossible. So this slide, I'm gonna spend a little time on this slide. It's supposed to be stressful. It's supposed to be chaotic.
Stressful.
Because this entire issue is chaos. It is as complex as anything out there, right? You have 193, so this is essentially the stakeholders, and there's probably more, and we could make it more complicated, but you got 193 nations recognized by the UN that are trying to figure out what to do about this. And we're gonna talk about the Global Plastics Treaty that's being debated right now. We're gonna go into detail about that a little bit later. So then if you go down into the solution sphere, that's where all the landmines are, right? Like there's so many different ways to address this, and that's where the fierce opposition happens. So EPR, extended producer responsibility, are basically laws where brands pay back into the system to fund the recycling system. This is something we're doing a lot of work on, something Susan spends a lot of time on. The EU and Canada have EPR rules. In the US, we don't have any yet, but there's 10 laws that are being considered right now in different states. And soon, we are gonna have increased regulations, and it's really gonna affect the value chain. It's fiercely debated, and in some cases makes it impossible for business to operate, and we've seen that with some of the Canada laws and some waste management in some of the Canadian EPR bills. You also have single-use plastic bans, which are fiercely debated, reuse and refill models, which is basically like re-engineering the way that we would act as consumers, where we're basically taking or sending back our packaging to get refilled. And this is what the environmental groups are really pushing towards. There's plastic credit offsets, which are very similar to climate offsets. Advanced recycling, which is a firestorm between activists and industry. Alternative materials, like different materials. There's not anything out there that scales or that can replicate plastic yet, but there are a ton of alternative materials that are on that way, but they also can wreak havoc on recycling infrastructure. We have cleanup efforts, just the general idea of scaling recycling infrastructure. Right now, just if you think about this is a crazy stat. 2 billion people in the world, most in areas that Ian works, don't have access at all to any kind of waste management, right? So they have to illegally dump or burn or just do whatever they can with it. They have just as much, they're using plastic just as much as we are, but there's zero infrastructure for waste management. That number is projected to double in 20 years. And in a lot of estimates, that's absolutely terrifying and like a no turning back for the oceans metric. So anyway, solutions, that's where the landmines are. We have the financial sector. Susan did an incredible job setting that up in general. You have Larry Fink writing his letters. You have the ESG scores that are holding accountable. You have this environmental activist takeover that happened with Exxon's board. I don't know if you guys read that last week, where 3 activists, climate activists, have 3 of the 20 board seats at Exxon, which is like that, and that's happening everywhere, and that's not gonna stop, right? But you also have the paradox in that all these companies in the plastic value chain have to report to shareholders, and they have to make money, and they can't do the right thing a lot of times. So the value chain, right? Starting with plastic, starting with commodity and gas and the petrochemical sector, moving to all the companies that are making packaging and consumer packaged goods and retailers. And this room largely is represented, by the waste management sector. You have advocacy and trade groups that are petitioning governments, hundreds of advocacy and trade groups all over the world that are supporting the plastic value chain. You have research producing universities that are putting reports out really all over the map, supporting activists, supporting the value chain. You have NGOs that are supporting the value chain, that are working directly. And then you have 1,000 NGOs led by Greenpeace and Gaia and the Environmental Investigation Agency in the Break Free from Plastic movement that are looking to shut off plastic at the tap. I mean, just totally turn it off. Because you have this confused consumer that's only recycling 10 to 14% of anything that gets made out there.
That's an important stat, right? I'm sure a lot of you know that, 10 to 14%. There's a lot of important stats there, and I'm sure you all have a headache by now. There's enough.
That's the idea. Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. I think Dave's point here is that it'll give you a seizure if you're not careful, right? There's so much to wade through. The question I think that we want to help you think through today is what does all this matter to your industry, right? To today in the United States, the waste industry, what is coming down the pike of all of these things that are, Dave does a really beautiful job here. I've seen him do this slide before of outlining all the stuff that's floating out there. And I think Susan dove into how some companies are doing a good job of setting goals around that. But I think the thing that we want to stress for you is this is not separate from your business model now. Whether you like it or not, whether you do it today, you wait 5 years, or you're forced to do it in 10 years when policy changes, if you don't embrace this and know what's happening here, it will negatively affect your business. It's not about hugs and rainbows anymore. It's not about climate change. It doesn't matter if you believe in climate change. It doesn't matter who you voted for. None of that stuff matters. It is a balance sheet issue. And if your business isn't thinking about this as a balance sheet issue, your business is going to be negatively affected by that in the next, not 10 years, in the next 2, 3 years. So if you're not already planning to navigate this map, also when it comes to the other materials in your value chain, this is something that you're already behind on. So we'll talk a little bit more about why in a minute, but sorry to interrupt.
No, please, keep it coming. So 15 million informal economy waste collectors, this last bubble, this is where Ian lives. And we don't know if it's 15 million. There's projections it could be 100 million, that 10 to 15 million. And these are people in the global south that are the last line of defense. These are these people that were in that landfill shot that I showed you, that are picking waste out off of beaches, out of landfills, and keeping plastics from getting into the environment. And it's an environmental rights, human justice issue, and one of the most important things that we need to discuss today. Ian's going to go super deep, so I'll kind of save that for him. But with that being said, yeah, perfectly on cue. Game on.
Okay. Yeah, so we started to dive into it, and thanks, Dave, for all of that. I think it frames the problem really beautifully and elegantly. You mentioned something that I think that's super important, which is that 2 billion people don't have access to waste management in what we call the global south. And despite that, they're actually better than the United States at saving materials from landfills in the ocean. In excess of, in some areas, in some of the poorest areas of the world, you're seeing upwards of 90% of materials that are being recycled, reused, pushed back into the circular economy, and 10% of the materials actually making their way into landfill. What I'm here to talk to you a little bit about is how that is going to affect your business. Because if you think about the United States as one of 193 countries in the UN, and the vast majority of those countries are actually looking at waste not from a landfill perspective, but from a how can we recycle, reuse as much of this material as possible, not because we want to, but because our lives depend on it, because we don't have access to a traditional structure. Those countries are actually leapfrogging the United States in terms of recycling and waste management technology, entirely on the backs of human beings. So in the United States, we think about things like optical sorters, we think about things like municipal and material recycling facilities. We think about equipment and technology that retrofits a landfill-based system with the opportunity and the ability to recycle. And most of us in this room know how difficult that's been, how unprofitable it is to recycle, how hard it is to make a buck when commodity prices fluctuate. Well, in the global south, this has been going on for years and years and years. They've never had access to trash trucks or traditional optical sorters or municipal recycling facilities. They have people, and they have to put rice on the table. And they know that there is a pegged global commodity price when it comes to certain materials, and they know they can make money at it, and the more efficient they do that, the more money they make. And let me tell you, in many respects, they're beating us in how we do that. So with that in mind, I want to paint a little bit of a picture of who this person is, and then we're going to use that, and we're going to talk about how that influences your business over the next 5 or 10 years. So I'm interested to know, what do you know about waste workers globally? Don't divorce yourself from the United States for a second, because I think we have a decent picture of what that looks like in the US. But toss it out there. When you think of a waste collector or a waste worker outside of the US, what do you think of? What comes to mind? Shout it out. Normal individual, all right, yep, that's right. What else? Self-employed, so entrepreneurial in some cases. Good. Anything else? Underage, yeah. Kids, right? That's fair. Yeah. Yeah, extreme poverty. In many cases, that's right. Yeah. We're getting a decent picture here, right? This is a picture that you've probably seen on late night TV sometimes, right? Where you're watching David Letterman, when David Letterman was on, and a commercial comes on and you see an ad for a nonprofit that has a kid with a distended belly and we're gonna give money because we feel bad for this particular person. And I'm here to dispel that myth, that rumor, right? It is not about feeling bad for the people that work in these communities. It's about recognizing them as colleagues. It's about understanding that they have things to offer. And in many cases, it's about understanding that they are better entrepreneurs in many areas than even the most sophisticated US businesses. So when we think about waste collectors, the reason this is Nadine, this is one of the people that collects and is in our network. You can see her super sacks of plastic bottles behind her. I have a picture of a woman because the best entrepreneurs in this system are always women. And I actually don't think that that's limited to this system. I think that's all systems. But the best entrepreneurs in the system for waste and recycling are 100% of the time women. Most of the time, they're mothers. There are at least 10 million of them. We actually think that there are many, many, many more. But I want you to do some quick math here. So we have let's just say 10 million for base material or for base numbers, collecting 50 to 100 million pounds of material a day, right? That means that there are people today who will, over the course of planet Earth, absent from waste trucks or anything that maybe you invest in, millions of dollars of CapEx and OpEx in order to make your systems run, who without any of that will collect 500 million to 1 billion pounds of trash today, tomorrow, the next day, the next day. They are the last line of the planet's defense from materials ending up and overwhelming our oceans and our streets. It's just an incredible number to me, 1 billion pounds a day. And that's probably low. Most of them have 3 or 4 children. So to whoever said that some of them are underage, that's right, because the average person generally earns between $2 and $3 a day picking up the material that they do. In some areas, and when we go into a waste community globally and we put a flag down, what we find is when we first start there, the culture is really around collection, so picking things up from the ground, right? For those of you who are in recycling know that once something touches the ground, it actually makes it much more difficult to recycle. Once we put processes in place, we find that that culture actually moves to a save culture. So you start to see routes that will come up. People will start to move around the community and collect certain materials on each day of the week. Sounds a little bit like the United States, right? But entirely self-organized, entirely self-elegant. We see that happening over and over again. In fact, in a supply chain that we operate in Vietnam, you can actually sell your route when you retire. So you're one of the people that some of you just described. You've been working in waste without a boss for the past 30 years. You're ready to retire. You've built up a route of 400 houses. You can actually take that route and sell it to somebody else coming up, and that's your pension. They've devised ways and opportunities to plan for retirement that don't depend on anything that we depend on. There's no Transamerica account to sign into in Vietnam. That 401k is entirely built on the back of what you've done for the past 30 years. But that $2 or $3 a day doesn't usually go all the way to where it needs to putting food on the table. Living wage in most countries in the world is actually around $10 or $12 a day. Vast majority of people who operate in this space earn 2 to 3. So it's an economic choice to have your kids collect, right? They don't do it because they want to put kids to work. It's not because that it's something they're choosing to do. Putting kids to work is about putting rice on the table. So when you have a choice between sending your kid to 3rd grade or making sure that everybody eats tonight, that choice becomes fairly straightforward. And I think it's really important that people, but all people, acknowledge that sacrifice. This isn't because of anything they did. It's not because of anything that was of who they are or how they think, or because they're lazy or any of those things. It's because this is where they were born, right? We have to acknowledge the fact that we were born here, in the place that we were, and we were offered certain privileges because of that. They do all of this, as I mentioned, with extremely low overhead. It's the most efficient group of entrepreneurs on the planet, bar none. And they are ruthlessly efficient at their jobs. Here's the part that I think is really important for you. they have nothing to lose, right? When we think about tech competition, right? When you think about a new search engine that comes up, or a new life sciences startup that comes up, the companies that generally do the best are the ones with the highest velocity, because they're generally outclassed by their higher technological competition. So if I'm Google, I have all the resources in the world, I have all the people in the world, right? The only thing that a startup has is velocity, efficiency, and motivation. I want you to think of the world's waste collectors as the next great startup. Right? If you frame it like that, it removes all sense of pity from the equation. It starts to treat people with the respect and dignity they deserve as colleagues. And it puts you in a place, as folks 3,000 miles away, to learn a little something from these systems. Because there is so much value here, right? To think that the rest of the world has come up with infrastructure that involves zero cap or OpEx, or very, very low cap or OpEx, and somehow has managed to collect the majority of the world's trash without any involvement from business, from larger business, is incredible to me. And I think there are things happening over the next 5, 10 years that would benefit all of you who work in waste in the United States to learn something from. If there's one thing I want you to walk away from from me talking today, it's this: that your colleagues in the Global South in many ways are as good or better at this than US waste operators, with better stories, and brands are starting to notice, right? Not that all of you have brands as clients. Some of you are brands. Some of you who work in waste infrastructure aren't depending on brands as clients. But there's a story element and human element to this that really, really matters. So where are we headed over the next couple of years? First, globally, and I'm not saying this is the United States, but globally, burn and bury is out. It's gone. It's not coming back, right? The idea of circularity, and circularity even in the United States is on its way up. Circularity in secondhand is going to be the fastest growing sector of retail, valued at $70 billion in the next 2 to 3 years. Traditional retail is going to actually go down in the next couple of years. Gen Z and millennials value secondhand and story more than any other element when they're purchasing goods and services. So even in the US, we're seeing this movement towards secondhand make a difference. But outside of the US, we are not going back to burn and bury. It's not going to happen. And not that a lot of you are going to put roots down with your companies outside the US, but if you are, it's important to know this. There is an incredible amount of investment in these chains. And what I'm saying with investment is, it's not the traditional type of investment where we're saying we're going to put $1 billion down to build 71 recycling facilities. You're seeing companies invest in these chains through what we're calling voluntary EPR. Right? They're aligning their supply chain by saying, look, I'll use an example. A company like Unilever is saying, we produce X amount of material each year. We collect X amount of material each year, but here's how much we collect under a human rights framework. And here's how many of those people within that human rights framework are earning a living income. Right? There's a delta there. So the push is to invest in that delta and develop more and better supply chain infrastructure. The people that are already doing a good job in those areas can do it better and faster. So what you're going to see is a leapfrogging take place in the Global South in much the same way that Africa did when it leapfrogged landline phone technology in the 90s and early aughts and went straight to cell phones. Not a lot of telephone poles all over North and South and East and West Africa. Lots of cell phones. Right? Never, like if you were Pac Bell in Africa, you never would have made any dollars. So I want you to think about landfill and waste management and company or organizations and thoughts or structures around traditional waste systems and the kind of the old traditional burn and bury model. And I want you to think that that just won't be developed in the Global South. And I think we're seeing that here in the United States is, I think the work that companies like Susan's are doing to actually broaden their horizons, to think about this, is a step in the right direction. But if we don't take 15 more steps from all organizations, we're going to be behind. This idea is already happening. It is inevitable. And ultimately, what I think it really means for waste operators in the US is that there is now going to be a choice. Do you join this band of misfits with a terrific story that the rest of the world's brands are investing in, or do you not? And if you don't, I think the thing that we're starting to see, the stories that will start to be told around that old traditional model are that it is archaic and it is left behind. And in many cases, I actually think it's going to paint it with that brush of good guy, bad guy. Because the folks that outside of the United States that are operating this way are going to be the heroes of this story. That is already happening. So it is incumbent on us who work in waste in the United States to think through, how will this affect our businesses? When we integrate the ESG goals that Susan talked about, let's not think about it just as a box that we have to check. But how does this affect our balance sheet? How does it affect our PR? What stories can we tell? How can we engage in the United States in these types of communities in ways that highlight and help them understand? We're doing some work right now with a Native American organization in Montana and Alaska, and helping them work through waste infrastructure on the reservation. But thinking through how these stories play into what your story is matters. And ultimately, putting your company in a position where you're participating in the solution matters. Not just to checking that box for the ESG goal, not just to how it makes you feel when you go home at night, but ultimately, whether your business makes or loses money. I'm going to turn it over to Dave to talk a little bit about how you can orient your company towards solutions as we kind of move through the next couple of years here.
Thank you, thank you. Hey, before I do that, can you give everybody a sense of the countries that you guys operate in?
Yeah, sure. We right now operate all over the Caribbean. We're in Africa, Asia. So let's think: Vietnam, India, Indonesia, Ghana, Nigeria, Haiti, Honduras, Taiwan. I think that's it right now. Maybe we have done some work in Bangladesh. Yeah.
Thank you, thank you. It's a good segue to the global treaty.